Hello, everyone. My presentation today is the FAA, Boeing, and the 737 MAX, and who is liable. This presentation looks at two aircraft crashes, Lion Air Flight 610 and Ethiopian Airlines Flight 302. Both of these crashes were Boeing 737 MAX aircraft, and both were attributed to a faulty AOA sensor. That triggered an MCAS system to automatically and repeatedly uh, trim the aircraft to nose down. The investigators found that Boeing had failed to alert the customers to the existence of the MCAS system and failed to alert FAA inspectors about changes to the system. Um, this presentation will examine who was really at fault. Was it Boeing? Was it the FAA? Or was it inexperienced, poorly trained flight crews? In 2010, Boeing needed a new aircraft to compete with Airbus's reconfigured A320. American Airlines had just announced that they were going to be refreshing almost their entire fleet. They were a big Boeing 737 customer, so Boeing wanted to get a piece of that. The 787 was still a ways away from being in production, so they decided to revamp their 737 into the 737 MAX. Um, this saved them Boeing about $20 billion in development costs, plus it eliminated a lot of FAA airworthiness certifications. Um, Boeing guaranteed that to their customers that their pilots wouldn't need any additional simulator training, which would save them a lot of money. Um, Probably the biggest new feature of the 737 MAX was the LEAP 1B engines, a very fuel efficient engine, but they were bigger than the existing 737 engines. So they had to be mounted higher and further forward under the wing. Um, Plus, the nose landing gear would have to be extended 8 inches. The incorporation of these new bigger engines definitely changed the aerodynamics of the aircraft. And Boeing discovered during flight tests that there was a possibility of a stall up, uh, nose stall up under certain flight conditions. So to help to eliminate uh, this stall condition, Boeing incorporated the Maneuvering Characteristics Augmentation System, MCAS, as a software fix. Here's a picture of the LEAP 1B engine mounted under the wing of the Boeing 737 MAX, and you can see how far forward it is of the wing. Some other things that Boeing had a problem with, they originally stated that the horizontal tail wouldn't travel more than 0.6 degrees uh, and only above at 0.67 Mach. Um, Boeing, during a revision, changed these parameters to where it would go from 0.2 to 0.84 Mach, so a much slower speed would this activate. And the tail would travel a whole lot more, 2.5 degrees, so almost over 4 times what they had told the FAA inspectors. And they also decided to only take the input from one of the AOA sensors. Um, During their safety analysis, Boeing had decided that this failure would only occur 1 in 223 trillion times. So they decided to just use the input from one sensor since they figured this would never happen. Also, it wouldn't draw attention to the system being incorporated into the aircraft. Um, Boeing did not tell the FAA inspectors about any of these new parameters or this change to just utilizing one AOA sensor, and they also didn't tell the FAA inspectors that there was a possibility that the MCAS could trigger repeatedly. It would pitch the nose down. If the air crews could recover it, it would pitch the nose down again, which is what happened during both of these aircraft crashes. And they also, Boeing decided to not include any information about the MCAS in the flight manual. So pilots and customers and FAA inspectors had no idea that this system was actually incorporated into the aircraft. The Federal Aviation Administration, uh, or the FAA, is authorized by the government, the federal government, to establish rules, investigate possible violations, prosecute violators, hold hearings, and levy fines as it applies to aviation. The FAA employs over 1,300 engineers, scientists, inspectors, test pilots, and other experts for approval of aircraft design, manufacture, and airworthiness certifications for all U.S. civil aviation goods and services. In the beginning of the 737 MAX certification process, the technical assessments were divided between the FAA and Boeing. Um, Originally, 26 of the 87 detailed certification tasks were assigned to Boeing, but by 2017, this number had increased to 79 out of 91. Now, this was due to pressure both from Boeing in order to get this aircraft in service as quickly as possible, but also from members of the federal government who didn't want to see one of their main manufacturing businesses, Boeing, be overtaken by Airbus, which is a French company. So the FAA inspectors were under a lot of pressure to get this aircraft in service as soon as possible. One of the tasks delegated to Boeing was the safety analysis of MCAS. As I said, uh, Boeing presented MCAS as a modification or an addition to an existing system, not as a new system itself. So the FAA didn't feel this was a critical part of their analysis, and that's why they had designated it to Boeing. Um, Apparently, this is a common practice. I wasn't aware of this until I started doing research into this. But designating these tasks to manufacturers by the FAA actually is pretty common and became more common after the passage of the Organizational Designation Authorization Program. This program was designed to help streamline the process and get new aircraft into service as soon as possible. Um, it expanded the number of tasks that organizations can do on behalf of the FAA, and these delegates are known as ODA units. That's what the organization is called, and then individuals within these units are called ODA holders. Um, they're approved by the FAA to carry out some of these tasks and inspections on behalf of the FAA. They're considered representatives of the administrator of the FAA, and they are supposed to be legally distinct and act independently from the organizations of which they are employed. Um, of course, during this program, um, the FAA avoids any type of language that says that these organizations are involved with self-certifications. These certifications are still FAA certifications. So on October 29, 2018, Lion Air Flight JT610 left Jakarta, Indonesia, heading for Penang City. Hope I'm saying that correctly. Um, Soon after takeoff, the aircrew reported problems with the flight control. Um, black box recordings discovered that there was a 20-degree difference in the um, data inputs from the two AOA sensors. Of course, MCAS only used the one sensor. The stick shaker activated, indicating a stall condition. Um, the MCAS started an automatic nose down stabilization input. Um, the aircrew used the stabilizer trim switch to apply nose up trim and got the aircraft level, but 5 seconds later, the MCAS activated again for nose down. So um, this battle went on over 20 times um, during the next 6 minutes, and eventually the aircraft crashed into the Java Sea and killed all aboard. Ethiopian Airlines Flight 302 crashed shortly after takeoff. Soon after takeoff, the left and right AOA sensors began displaying different values. Um, they believe that a bird strike uh, hit the AOA sensor that MCAS uses, which made it inactive. Uh, MCAS activated nose down. When the flaps were retracted, the pilots applied electric trim up. 5 seconds later, it was nose down again. And this went on 4 or 5 times before the aircraft eventually crashed into the ground at over 500 knots. It was reported that the aircraft created a crater of over 30 feet when it impacted the ground. And again, all aboard were killed. This is a picture of what was left of the 737 MAX for the Ethiopian airline Flight 302. So the question is, who is liable? Tort law is personal injury law. It's divided in 3 categories: intentional tort, negligent tort, and strict liability. In this case, strict liability is not dependent on how careful or diligent a manufacturer is, only if their actions cause the crash. Um, they're strictly liable if their products prove to be dangerous when used by the product's average user, which in this case are pilots. Strict liability can result from design or manufacturing defects or a failure to properly warn consumers of the dangers associated with the product. Uh, Design defect cases are those in which the entire product line is defective. Now, obviously, the courts found Boeing liable for these things. They were fined $2.5 billion by the U.S. Justice Department after being found guilty of conspiring to defraud the FAA Aircraft Evaluation Group. Boeing also had to pay $200 million to the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission to settle civil charges from misleading investors on the safety of the 737 MAX. The investigation found that Boeing intentionally misled the FAA about the MCAS in order to avoid customers having to send pilots to additional simulator training. So, in a nutshell, Boeing put profit in front of safety. Their strict liability stems from a design defect, utilizing the input of only one AOA sensor, resulting in a single point of failure, which anyone who's ever worked on aircraft know that's the engineering golden rule you never want to break. You always want to have backup, and if possible, backup to the backup. So Boeing failed to warn customers about the incorporation of the MCAS into the aircraft, and they also failed to install a warning system should the AOA sensors disagree. So that falls into the strict liability of failure to warn your consumers. They hid the changes, the revision D of the MCAS system from the FAA, and they also failed to include any mention of the MCAS in the flight manuals. As harsh as it may seem, flight crew does share in some of the liability for these situations. The MCAS was incorporated into an aircraft basically to overcome poor airmanship. The MCAS was only designed to be triggered when an aircraft was in a configuration it had no business being in. Most pilots who have encountered a similar problem known as trim runaway have trained or have the experience that all they have to do is basically disable the electrical trim control and utilize the manual wheels on the center console to make your trim adjustments, which is actually what happened the night before for the Lion Air flight. The pilot had a similar situation, and he disabled the electrical trim control and used manual till he landed. Their technicians decided that there was a bad AOA sensor, and they had replaced it, which turned out to be a faulty part. Boeing claimed that if the air crews had followed the steps in the flight manual for trim runaway, the crashes never would have happened in the first place, so they shouldn't be liable, which didn't carry much water. Um, Boeing had designed the system for the pilots to be actually the primary stopgap should a system malfunction occur. Um, so the actual, the actions of the pilots actually called into their operators training and qualifications for their pilots. Um, and so in this situation, anyway, there is some causal responsibility to be shared with Boeing by these flight crews. As far as the FAA is concerned, I have to be honest with you, I had no idea that some of these tasks could be performed by manufacturers, the ODAs at these manufacturers. I thought FAA handled all this stuff. So that was a new learning experience for me. And it makes a lot of sense. It's not realistic to think that the FAA, a government agency, could attract and hire and keep people of such high technical education. I know here at Lockheed Martin there's hundreds of jobs open for aeronautical engineers, so I can understand why they would delegate some of these tasks to the manufacturers themselves. um, as I said, Boeing presented MCAS as just an addition to the existing speed trim system, so the FAA didn't feel that it was critical enough for them to examine. Um, and then you have the discretionary function exemption, which immunizes the U.S. government and its agencies from liability from the actions or failure to perform a function of that organization. Um, so basically, the FAA has immunity um, from any type of liability. Um, they were basically going along with policy. The delegation of certain tasks to ODAs was a policy adopted by the FAA. And then finally, the investigators found no corruptible relationships between Boeing and the FAA. From a biblical perspective, um, the Bible tells us in Numbers 32:23 that to be sure your sin will find you out. I found that especially true on aircraft. If people try to cover stuff up or do things improperly, it will always get found out. And it's always been my experience that it's better to live up or own up to your mistakes than it is to try and cover them up. Um, that's the part that'll always get you. Um, these aircraft are only going to work as well as we design them and maintain them. They can't compensate for our mistakes or neglect. So, um, the a motto that I've always tried to live by, Bible verse I've always tried to live by. Therefore, we should do all things as if we are doing them for our Lord, as it tells us in Colossians 3:23. Um, Everything that we do on aircraft has to be perfect because the people who are using those aircraft deserve nothing less. Um, as I said before, it's always better to own up to your mistakes than it is to try and cover them up. The Bible tells us if we will confess our sins, we will be forgiven. I found that true at work uh, most times. um, that if we own up to our mistakes, uh, it's a learning experience for everybody. And as long as we don't continually repeat the same mistakes, we will be forgiven. Plus, you will sleep a whole lot better at night knowing that the work that you performed uh, is as perfect as you can get it. Uh, Thank you for your time. I'd enjoy any type of feedback that anyone can give me, and I hope you all have a great day.